Good evening, Cherries fans, and welcome to this latest show here on Up the Cherries in All Departments. Now, before I do welcome on my special guest, here's a little bit about our sponsors, Dental on the Banks. To find out what they can do for you, visit dentalonthebanks.co.uk. Now, my special guest today is somebody who saved the Cherries. He's the author of the book Cherries in the Red. He was also pivotal in the Winter Gardens movement back in 1997. Without him, this club would not have survived. It is a pleasure to welcome on to Up the Cherries in All Departments, Trevor Watkins. Good evening, Trevor. How are you?
I'm good. Even better that we go into Christmas with somebody who's going to spend some money in the transfer window.
Definitely. It's exciting times at AFC Bournemouth. I'm sure you'll agree. But thank you so much for coming on this special show with us, and it is an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
So let's start off where it all began. So you grew up in Bournemouth. What were your earliest memories of supporting your hometown club?
Well, I mean, memory might be deceptive, but I'm pretty sure I can remember being at that very first game, which was Bournemouth against Walsall. It was February 74. Bournemouth won 1-0, and it was a day very much like I'm seeing today. Bleak grey skies. We stood on the Brighton beach end because we could only afford to stand there with the away supporters. I remember it was something like 5 pence for me to stand and 35p for my dad to go. And he would put me on the old metal bars that would be on the concrete in the Brighton beach end, which is a bit of a gravelly, shingly mess, as you may or may not remember, and bitterly cold. And we would stand just between the entrance, between the old rickety turnstiles and the scoreboard, which was an old metal contraption which had letters of A to Z, and the man at half time would take numbers up and put them on, hook them onto against the letter, and you'd have to have a program so that you could look at Blackpool, Bolton, or whatever the game was game C, and you'd know what the halftime score was. And as things progressed, my dad got me one of those little radios that would tune in to medium wave, which was about all you could get then. You'd have this terrible reception. But as time progressed, you could actually listen to and get better updates as to what the score would be. And that was it, really. I remember games like we'd beaten Crystal Palace 4-0, and the away end was packed, and I was in there with my dad. And that was, again, quite an amazing experience, because it was at a time when actually, away fans were great. It didn't really matter. I know there was a lot of violence that time with Leeds and other clubs in the 70s, but we were looked after, and they were my memories. And I used to go with my dad week in, week out. I remember buying a bicycle. He bought me a bicycle once, and that meant I missed the game. I was very upset about that. But, when it came to doing a school project about my career I decided I want to be my career as a professional footballer. And that would have been 75, 76. Because I left primary school then. I was at St. Catherine's in Hengistbury Head. And I remember Captain Kirk, the physio, who was at the club for donkey's years. being so good as to escort me, and I have one of those old cameras, those thin cameras with the 110 films in the
Oh,
back.
crikey, yeah, I can
Yeah,
remember 'em.
and
Yeah.
not like today. You had one chance. You had to get it
Yeah.
right. And players like Ian Cunningham, Tommy Heffernan, and others who would be practicing, and they let me take pictures of them. I don't remember Steve's name, winger, and it was great. And I used to go and watch the reserves play. I used to go and watch the youth team play. Some people may remember people like Kevin Reeves, who went on to great
Mhm.
things, who played for us, and that was it really, and that got me hooked.
Do tell us about your career leading up to 1997 and supporting the club throughout your time working in London.
I was, I wanted to be an English teacher. I went to Bournemouth Grammar School, great school, loved it. Played football for the third team, sometimes the second team if I was lucky. Loved playing football, played rugby, loved sport, kept on watching Bournemouth. Decided I want to be an English teacher, so I took my A levels, applied to university, didn't get a place. I found that bizarre. I did my headmaster. At the end of the day, I had predicted grades that were good. They were A's, a couple of A's and a B. I was predicted, and I was doing some S levels. So when it came to clearing, I was offered a place at St Andrews in Scotland. But by then, I had my A level results, which were good. And so the school said, well, why don't you apply to go to Oxford or Cambridge? And I decided that maybe I wasn't supposed to be an English teacher. I should get a law degree. It might be more useful than English. So I decided to apply to Oxford to read law. And I did that, and I did well in the exam. I was very lucky. I got through. They had 14 people interviewed for 12 places, but they offered me a place on another deferred year. So I decided not to do that because Reading offered me a law spot. I thought, what am I going to do? And a friend of mine, Richard Williams, who'd been retaking his A levels at the time, he said that his friend, Hugh Ashley, who was a teacher at Porchester School, was launching a new program on the BBC called Something Else. And would I like to be a presenter on this program? So I got this job. I wasn't paid, but my job was to go and interview anybody who came to the south of England. So I at 18, 19, very spotty years old, I ended up going interviewing people like Meatloaf and UB40 and Tina Turner and Michael Hutchins in Excess. And I had UB40 throwing bread rolls at me because they were stoned at the time, so I thought. I ended up doorstepping Prince at Terminal 4 at Heathrow. Bizarre, but great fun. And so I went to do law. And I thought, well, I've got a law degree. I should probably qualify as a lawyer. So I qualified as a lawyer. So I thought, well, I may as well. There's not much direction here. You can see it just kind of drifted into it all. And I found myself being a litigator in London, which, being a lawyer is actually reasonably well paid, a lot more than a teacher. So I thought, well, I don't mind this. So I carried on doing that and carried on watching Bournemouth play. I lived up in London, but then moved back to Christchurch. And middle of January 97, I'd been watching the news that obviously there's no secret. Ken Gardner was chairman. He was in trouble. The club was in trouble. It was losing a lot of money. Norman Hayward was there, Brian Willis. They'd pumped money in. And it was all going off the rails. I think the club had borrowed £75,000 on the basis that they would repay 100 within 3 months, which is like a ridiculous rate of interest. And 5 directors resigned at Christmas 96. And I was at a game against Rotherham. Again, another terribly grey day. It was a terrible game, really. And I was by this time, rather than stand on the away end, we'd worked our way around the ground. Because I was working in the city, I could afford the real expensive seats. The derelict main stand that had been got from the Wembley exhibition of 1925 or whatever it was. And my dad and I, the benefits of having the most expensive seats meant we got to sit on wooden seats in what was the director's box, which was something of a hovel, and got a cup of tea and a biscuit, one of those sort of rich tea biscuits at half time. But Terry Lovell, the commercial director, was down in the cubby hole, as it was, at half time. I said, Terry, you don't know me. I'm our vice president. I work up in London for a big law firm. You've clearly got problems. I don't know whether this helps, but, I can give time. I haven't got any money. And he said, oh, yeah. Oh, we'd love some help. We'll be in touch. And about a week later, nothing. So I rang him. He said, "Oh, no, they do want some help. They do want to meet you." And I got this phone call. He said, he came back to me. He said, "Can you go to," I can't remember the name of it, but it's a 2-star hotel in the red light district of Bournemouth. They'd love to meet you. I said, "Who?" He said, "Well, the 2 directors, Brian Willis and Norman Hayward." And I did. But when I got there was a guy called Pack. And Roy Pack, superstar professional footballer, apparently, Australian guy, who, "I'm here to save the club. The club, this is ridiculous. The club, they don't owe money to Lloyds Bank. Nothing can happen. We're not," that kind of tenor. They're not his exact words. And eventually, after 3 hours of listening to conspiracy theories, some of which he actually has some good points, that neither Hayward nor Willis should pay out under their personal guarantee to Lloyds Bank. He was right. At the end of the day, they didn't have to pay out. But he was convinced that the bank couldn't appoint anybody to run the club and it was all going to be fine. I did what I could. And 3 days later, the bank shut the club on a Friday morning. Arthur Anderson were appointed as receivers, which meant they were in control of the club. In those days, there weren't really mobile phones. I got back from work. No working from home at that time, no pandemic. I ended up going downtown with some friends, got back home, as I would do on a Friday night. And there was a message on my voicemail at home saying there's a meeting between the club, Hayward, Willis and Pack, and the receivers on Saturday morning. Would I go to it? So I was playing football that day in Bournemouth League, Saturday League Division 4 for... I don't even remember who I was playing for at the time, but it was a reserve team. So I was on my way to the game and I rang my friend Richard, I'd had my radio show with all those years previous, and said, "Look, I've just been to a meeting where I've been told that the Football League are going to put Bournemouth out of existence by Wednesday. So this afternoon's game against Bristol City away is going to be the last game ever. And we have a choice. We either raise enough money to cover the losses for the season." At that point, the club was losing £100,000 a month. So the league wanted to see that the club could complete its fixtures. So it needed to raise £600,000. And in the meeting, Paul Whitehead and Alan Lewis, who were the receivers, they'd said to Pack and Hayward and Willis, "Look, we represent the bank. They're not putting any more money in." Hayward would go, "I'm not putting any money in. You're crooks. You shouldn't be appointed. You shouldn't be in charge. It's my club," that kind of approach. And so they looked at me and said, "Well, you want to help. Why don't you raise the money?" So I went on the radio show with Richard. I went down the BIC, went and did an interview and said, "Look, this is what I know." I arrived at Kinston to play football. And the guys in the changing room said, "You're late. Why did we just hear you on the radio?" And people started ringing up, offering to help. And Terry Lovell, bless him, the commercial director, he called a meeting at the club for Sunday evening. Now, this scared Roy Pack because he was on to me like a dog on heat, basically. He did not want to lose control over this process. And he got me to go to this hotel where bizarrely we ended up in some bedroom with the curtains closed with some guy, I can't remember his name, that he claimed was going to be, again, a savior. He then said, "We're going to go and see Max Clifford, the publicist who's died recently." And for a meeting, we didn't have a meeting. We turned up at the Carlton Hotel and tried to locate Max. And Roy Pack doorstepped him. Max hadn't got a clue. But Roy was trying to spin the story about receivers shouldn't be in charge, And some of people may remember that eventually there was an article in the Daily Mail, I think, which said, why is Max picking a number on Bournemouth? And Max was then starting to target me. And Pack really didn't want to lose control. We had this meeting on the Sunday night at the club. And I kind of worked that one out at that point. And I said, "Look, if there's going to be a chance of saving the club, the fans need to get together. We need to be independent of you, Mr. Pack, and of you, the receivers. We need," and my game there was, we didn't know who were the good guys, who were the bad guys, or if anybody were good or bad. So 5 or 6 people. Ken Dando, great guy, lifelong fan, accountant. Andrew Kay, again, lifelong fan, still goes sometimes to the games now. And Peter Aldersley, a guy called Andy Noonan, who's an architect. John Hiscock, again, who still goes to games. John Saunders, who was sponsor then, still sits at the games now. Michael Lowe, the vicar, and who sadly passed on not long after, but his wife still goes to the game, Pat. You know, these people all said, we'll help. And we got a committee of 6. And little did I know then that what would then happen was that every day from then through to, well, it didn't stop in June, but for at least the next 6 months, my day would consist of get up 6 a.m., go to London, work, get back 7 p.m., go straight to meetings in Northbourne, meet with the committee, work till 1 a.m., go home, go to bed at 2, get up. And that was life for 6 months. So that's how it started. But we rode our luck. That day on the Sunday night, the council were there. They said, why don't you have a public meeting? Here's a theatre in the town, the Winter Gardens. Use it. Go and do it. Go and have a meeting. And that's what we did. And 3,500 people turned up. And I choreographed it. I was sitting on the stage. We collected, what was 35, 40,000 pounds. Nowhere near the 600, but enough of a message to the league that the town wanted to save its club. The next morning, someone rang me. Actually, someone in the Hayward family who didn't get on with Norman. And this became clear. There was Norman on one side, other Haywards on the other. And they'd all fallen out. They didn't respect each other necessarily. And this other Hayward, Geoffrey Hayward, said, I'll give you £100,000. And then the Times rang up and said, we'd like to make you our face of sport this weekend in the newspaper. By Saturday, which I think we played Blackpool at home, 8,500 or 8,201, as I remember, turned up. And I haven't prepared. I just kind of lodged in my brain. We started seeing that the town supported its club more. More money came in. So we didn't have to give the money that we created a trust. And eventually, we decided to try and make a bid to buy the club. And you know, I remember being in a meeting with Lloyds Bank, and they said, we got a bid from Mel Bush, who's actually Jason Tyndall's father-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
We got a bid from Norman Hayward, and we got your bid. Yours is the lowest. You're the most inexperienced, but we'd like you to buy the club. I said, well, we've made our offer. And they said, well, we'll lend you the money because we're sitting on all this real estate. It's our land. We don't really care. Now we've done the hard bit of putting receivers in. We don't care if the club goes bust because we can build houses on this. We'll make our money back. We'll have a bit of bad PR, but we'll live through it. So why should we give you the land and give you the club? So we struck a deal. Oh yeah, people like Peter Phillips criticized it subsequently, but he wasn't there at the time. I'm not sure that necessarily he would have understood the intricacies of insolvency law. We had very good lawyers at Leicester Aldridge advising us, and they said to survive, there's 2 things the club needs to do. 1, it needs to pay a fair price for the assets. 2, it needs to pay off the existing creditors. The existing creditors were, there's lots of rules as to how you deal with these things. And we basically agreed a deal where we would pay everybody 10p in the pound over 10 years. For people who say they don't think that was a good deal, they don't really know what they're talking about, in my view, because this is no disrespect meant, because if you're involved in it, and as I have now been for 25 years, that was a very good deal because it bought time. It bought opportunity. What it didn't buy was how you transform a club that's losing £1 million, £1.5 million a year into a club that makes profit. Because as the supporters and the fans, we raised about 150, 200,000 pounds. I persuaded others with money to raise about 500,000. So that's 650,000 there or thereabouts. On a club that's losing 1.5 million a year, to be able to sell beer in the supporters club, we had to pay off the supplier who would cut off the pumps unless we cleared that debt. To be able to get people through the turnstiles, we had to upgrade certain things. To be able to function, we needed players. The first player we bought was Justin Harrington on a free from Leicester. It wasn't easy. And it's very easy, however, if you're on the outside, to poke fingers and say, Andrew Kay, Ken Dando, you didn't know what you were doing. Perhaps we didn't, but we were the ones who stood up. And there's a great picture of Steve Fletcher, Eddie Howe, excuse me, Ken Dando, Andrew Kay, and myself on the South End, which was the old home end, the day we completed the deal. Champagne going off. What people didn't know was that Andrew Kay and I had been sitting in the supporters club until midnight, 1 a.m. the night before, wondering what we were going to do, because we figured we have enough money to last 3 months. And I had to ring every single investor that had put up 5,000 or more, the Rod Taylors, the Andy Noonans, the Peter Aldersleys, and the many, many more, and say, do you want us to do this deal or not? Because it could all go pop again in 3 months. Well, you ride your luck and you make your luck. They all said yes. We took the club over. We didn't even have permission from the Football League to kick off at Northampton, where we happened to win 2-0 first game of the season. But we went there. We won. And luck came to us because we sold Matty Holland for £800,000. That was the opening bid on that was 150. And I negotiated that up to 800. That's what I'm good at. But we had other people like Andrew and Ken who were good at other things, and it made for a great team spirit. And Mel Machin got the team going. And those of you might remember Frank Rolling and our auto windscreen semi-final against Walsall, where we were cruising at Walsall. I think we won 2-0 there. And it was all looking really quite good at Bournemouth, until Walsall scored a couple straight after half-time, and it was all looking a bit rocky. And then Frank Rolling, who'd never been known to be, he had a nosebleed going up to attacking penalty area. I don't know what he was doing up there, but he wellied the ball in with 8 minutes to go. And we got to Wembley, and what a great occasion. Put those two things together, it bought us a lot of time. And, first club rescued by its community, effectively crowdfunding at its finest, never been done before. And we set a trend.
Was there anything, Trevor, or anybody that you felt was responsible for putting the club in the situation that we were in before you took over? And secondly, for the younger fans out there, comparing it to what we've got now, what was that financial situation like? How dire was it?
Well, dire because it was going to go out of business, completely go out of business once and for all, and never recover. It was a wing and a prayer job. Mm-hmm. It was absolutely, there were 2 or 3 occasions when the club was minutes from going out of business. And it has been subsequently. And it's all part of an evolution. I'm not going to comment on whether Ken Garden knew what he was doing. I think frustratingly, Norman Hayward, for example, is a hugely successful businessman. He's shrewd. He's successful. He knows how to make money. Determined, a lot of characteristics. And together with Brian Willis, they actually made a good double act. But they inherited a situation they hadn't necessarily been part of. They'd passed the club on, a bit like Jeff Mostyn had done in years later when he passed it on to Paul Baker. You pass on, you sell the club, and you trust what's going to happen. And it all gone off the rails. I mean, the club had got into a situation where directors, and this has happened time and again since, directors put money up to help support the club and never got it back. They lost it all. And so Norman and Brian did a good job, and so did the people before them. I think everybody who's been at the club has been there with the right intent. Actually, there's probably 2 people, maybe Paul Baker and Savramuto, who was in there as chief exec. I'm not sure what their motives were, but generally speaking, Eddie Mitchell, who can divide opinion, Max Demin, who doesn't divide opinion, has been amazing for the club. Jeff Mostyn, who wasn't a Bournemouth fan. Tony Swaysland wasn't a Bournemouth fan, became chairman and for a time. Everybody comes in and comes in for the right reasons. and the right qualities to try and ensure they do the best by the club. So I don't think we've got anybody you can point at and say it's all your fault. I said that the time that came subsequently, ultimately, Peter Phillips oversaw a sale and leaseback, and a lot of people have criticised him and said, well, you shouldn't have done that. I know he's pointed the finger previously at us, but you can't point the finger at Peter in that sense, because he had the hand that he was dealt and he had to play it.
Mm-hmm.
I would have done what he did. Now, Jeff comes in and then looks to sell. And, face value, Paul Baker and Savramuto were a good team. I saw Savramuto, who was put in as CEO, down on the beach in Rio, because I was speaking at a conference, all very nice, with Tony Adams. You couldn't make it up sometimes. But I think, Eddie comes in for all the right reasons. He meets Max. He brings Max in. Max does everything for the right reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I brought Peak Six into the club as 25% investors in 2016, 17. They came in because they wanted to be involved and help. And I don't think anybody's evil, and there's nobody there with bad intent. I said we had that blip with Paul Baker, and that's been long documented as to what happened at Chester and other clubs. And I don't know if that was necessarily the right thing for the club. But again, I'm sure that within that, he was looking at doing things for the right reasons. It's just differing degrees.
Going back to 97 now, there was, if I remember rightly, we had a charity match against Southampton.
We did.
Friendly game, didn't we?
Friday night.
On a Friday night, yeah, I remember that. And I remember a certain Mr. McDougall making an appearance.
Fantastic.
What kind of impact did he have at the time when obviously you guys were all busy trying to save the club? What kind of impact did he have?
Oh, yeah, fantastic. Again, he's iconic. 9 goals in an FA Cup game, and his diving header against Aston Villa. All of this is quite amazing in terms of his track record and what he's done. So his impact was significant, and he's iconic. He's a lightning rod around which fans could say, him turning out. I had over 10,000 at that game. Him turning out on a Friday night against Southampton, again, what a great support from a local rival to come and do that for us, no cost. He absolutely amazing. And he said, I can do anything I can do. He said, Trevor, you've done all this for nothing. What can I do to help you? I said, I'll tell you what. Would you like to play Bournemouth League Division 4 for my reserve team on Saturday afternoon? So bless him. He came down the rec. He registered. So for a group of chaps as us to play with a legend, and he was hilarious, great fun. He played the whole 90 minutes. Fantastic. I'm sure he's not forgiven me since, and we're still friends now. We still catch up and see each other, and that is the nice thing. That camaraderie. A lot of the people who are still alive from that time, we see each other at games. We still sit. Well, obviously we built the new stadium, but we still sit in the seats we've always sat in. We still chat about things and catch up. We're all a bit older. We all still think we look as young as we did then. Now see Ted in the States, and it's quite incredible, really. But we do our best.
What struggles would you say, Trevor, that you had throughout your time as chairman of the club? Was there anything that cropped up, or things that were there from the previous regimes that just kind of stuck with us for that time?
Well, how are you going to pay the wages at the end of the month? And which players should you sign? We made a bit of money in the auto windscreen, so we thought we needed a striker. Why don't we buy Roger Bolly? 33 goals. I think he got 20-something the season before. Yeah. On paper, fantastic. Mm-hmm. No one checked whether his legs still worked. So we bought this player for £100,000. When you make a decision, when we were in the top 6 and we needed to raise money to pay the wages, because that was the problem. None of us had money. Mm-hmm. So the vision is great. The community bit is great. Being involved as supporters, brilliant. If you haven't got money, you still got to pay the wages. You still got to, and we had to be clever on how we traded, because that's where we could make money. And the problem was, people think, oh, Trevor, you went and sold our left back. You went and sold Jamie Vincent. I didn't sell him. A load of us sat for a long time. What can we do? How do we do it? How do we make, and how do we mitigate risk? Mel Machin is manager. He inputted, right, Mel, we've got to sell somebody. What can you survive? What can you cope with? How do we play this? And he said, I can play Krista Warren at left back. What if we give you somebody? I've got Willie Huck. I've got Richard Hughes. Obviously, Richard's with the club now. I lose my left back, who's my corner taker as well. And he's a good left back. I can cope. That position I can cover. And I think the first game after Jamie went, we won. But then we hit the buffers. But teams do that. And we went into the last game playing Wrexham where we needed a result that would keep us. We ended up 7th on goal difference, I remember. And that felt terrible. But equally, one of the decisive moments that saw my end of my time as chairman was when we had a bid from Wigan to buy Eddie Howe and Richard Hughes for 1.25 million. And it was cash, and it would all go into the the club. And the decision then was, do we sell and take the money, or do we stick? And we had a board meeting. 5 of us voted. 3 said, no, don't sell. 2 said, yeah, we should sell. And so we didn't. So as a result of that, we were short of cash. We didn't have money to pay the wages. And Tony Swaysland, actually, he didn't say it to me. He sent my friend Andrew, who was CEO, to see me and said, basically, Tony says he should be chairman. He'll put the money up. If you step down as chairman, you can stay as a director. And to be honest, I got to the point there where I never took money out of the club. It was all consuming. My view was you should be at every game. You should work on behalf of the club. You should do everything you could if you took that position. Fair enough. Tony wanted to be chairman, so I stepped down. He became chairman. Obviously, that didn't really last that long for him in the end. And I stepped down knowing that I had done everything I could do with the best interest of the club at heart. At the end of the day, you can't win, and that's something I learned. You can't win with everybody. The irony was we're a group of fans that did our bit to rescue the club. We happened to be figureheads. Within weeks, there was a new independent supporters group questioning who we were. And people were saying, has he ever been to a game, that Watkins bloke? Anyway, I remember Roy Pack saying, Watkins is only in it for his own good. He's doing this for his career. You mark my words. Now, the irony was, or is, I wasn't, but in actual fact, it has transformed my life. I wouldn't be on here if we hadn't done this. And,
Exactly.
Here am I working with most of the top European football teams, working with buyers, sellers, working across professional sport and being paid for it, which is incredible. There were some pretty down moments in between times, but, they're the kind of things I learned.
How was the Dean Court, which we enjoy today, funded? And tell us about the Ken Dando Stadium appeal.
Yeah, well, the problem was we had no money. We had no money to build a new stadium, but the council was shutting 2 ends of the ground. And because they shut 2 ends of the ground, we had to build a new one. And the answer was, well, how on earth do we go about doing it? So we can go back to the supporters. That's going to raise some money. We can go to the council. What, a Conservative council going to lend money to a football club? No. Well, we demonstrated that we had a value as a community club. We were doing things the council would otherwise have to pay for. So they agreed to put some money in return for services. That was a new, innovative way. The Football Foundation said there was a percentage limit on what you could get from them as a grant to build a stadium. However, they had an annual football match against the Football Association they wanted to win. So they said to me, because I knew the guys there, well, could we borrow some of your players? I said, when are you playing? Friday night in Ealing. I said to Mel, look, we've got Oxford United away in the league on Saturday. There's quite a lot riding on this because we're trying to get them to give us 3.5 million quid, which is much more than we normally do as a percentage. Can you help me? So he gave me 2 players, and we took them up to Ealing on a Friday night. And I think the football foundation were 2-0 down to the FA after 20 minutes. Put our 2 lads on, they won easily, and we got our 3.5 million. But ultimately, again, this is we had to build. We could only build 3 sites. That's all we could afford. And even then, things went a bit awry because we needed to find somebody else. There was no institutional lending, no bank lending that would do this. So we found a guy called Stanley Cohen, and he was, again, I think I'll keep it short because he was prepared to help. And perhaps the terms on which he was prepared to help were more onerous than people thought they might be. And so when it came to it, Glenmore Investments, as they were, or Glenmore Holdings, they had more a hold over the club. And, you know, without Stanley's money, the stadium wouldn't have been built. So, and the stadium needed to be built. And that all got sorted in time. But, you know, remembering this was a club that was losing $1 million, $1.5 million a year, who was trying to keep up. We'd had some success, but it didn't have the rich benefactor that we had with Max Demin and now with Bill Foley. And so the Ken Dando Stadium appeal was another great way of doing it. And eventually, you may or may not remember, we ended up with a sort of fundraise from the supporters as well. And it all worked really well to get the new home. But continued losses, continued debt, a continued need to keep up then leads to, well, what can we do next? Well, we'll sell the stadium and lease it back. Great for clearing debt, great for resetting, but then you don't own that asset anymore. And then, obviously, the years after Peter, when I went to Paul Baker, with Jeff stepping in, Jeff doing things all the right way, Paul Baker goes off the rails, and then it goes back into insolvency again. I remember I was in Florida working. I got a phone call from the Football League who wanted to ask me when the club had last been in administration or in receivership, so they could try and determine which points penalty they should give them. And of course, all of this led to the most amazing year under Eddie Howe.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us on this special show. Do remember part 2 will be coming tomorrow. So please do hit that like, that subscribe, and that bell button to be alerted to when that drops. Also, do check out all of our other interviews if you are wanting more Cherries related content before listening to part 2. You can find interviews with, of course, Eddie Mitchell, who was name dropped within this interview. We've also got special guests as well that we've had on, like Charlie Daniels, Steve Cook, Steve Fletcher, of course, another man that was name dropped as well, and many, many more. So please do remember to hit that like and that subscribe and bell button. But part 2 will be along tomorrow. So until then, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow. Up the Cherries.